Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The program is about to begin. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The program is about to begin. Our next panel, The Axis of Resistance, Iran and Great Power Competition, will discuss how Iran's alliance with Beijing and Moscow is posing a significant threat to U.S. interests and fundamentally reshaping the landscape of great power competition. Joining us for this panel are Mark Dubowitz, CEO of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, who is an expert on the Islamic Republic's global threat network, Carrie Filipetti, who currently serves as the executive director of the Vandenberg Coalition and previously advised U.S. Ambassador Nikki Haley on issues related to counterterrorism, the Middle East, and Western Hemisphere. And this panel is moderated by Cameron Khansarinia, Nufti's vice president. Please join us in welcoming our speakers.
Thank you again for being with us today, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks to our first panelists and my estimable colleague Andrew for our first panel. There's really no two better people, I think, to be with. It's a particular pleasure for Nufti and for me personally to be here with Mark and Carrie. Even before all that's happened in the past week, since last Saturday's terrorist attack on Israel, two individuals who lead, in my opinion, some of the most important foreign policy institutions in Washington, advocating for policies that I think many of us in this room and many of us watching online and those watching inside Iran support, because it recognizes reality, it supports U.S. national security, the interests of the Iranian people, and really it's great to have here in Washington two great friends of the people of Iran and the Iranian American community. So we're thankful to be with you today, and thank you for joining us. And of course today we're supposed to talk about on this panel great power competition, the nature of the relationship of the Islamic Republic with China, Russia, how that affects U.S. national security, and we'll get into that certainly, but we can't start, I think, without addressing recent events, the Hamas terrorist attack in Israel. And so, Mark, I'd like to start with you. You know, you've been following this, obviously, speaking about it consistently as you have for years. What's the latest? What do you sense is going on? Please address the role of the Islamic Republic. And again, thank you for being with us today.
Cameron, first of all, thank you so much, Carrie. Thank you for being together today. I just want to thank all of you, too, because the past few days have been absolutely horrifying for those of us with friends and family in Israel, and witnessing the atrocities of this regime. It is so comforting to be with all of you First of all, thank you to Nufti, because I've been here for 20 years and I've had to deal with the nonsense that came out of Nyack that was not being opposed and that was not being condemned. And thank God we now have a proud Iranian-American organization that is telling the truth about the nature and evil of the Islamic Republic and the regime in Iran. So thank you to all of you. I also want to say that, one of the things that surprised me is how many people were surprised. How many people were surprised and shocked by the barbarity of Hamas. And again, to be with Iranian Americans today, you understand the barbarity of what Israel faced over the weekend, because you and your family and your friends in Iran have faced this kind of barbarity since 1979. You have witnessed a regime that has murdered and raped and tortured your people, that launches chemical attacks against Iranian children in their schools. So for all of you in this room, you were not surprised by what you saw over the weekend from Hamas, which has long been supported, financed, trained, and militarized by Khamenei, the Revolutionary Guards, and the regime in Iran. So again, to be in a room with people who are not surprised because you understand the nature and gravity of the threat from the regime in Iran. And thank you to Nufti and all of you, because in the coming days and weeks and months, it'll be essential for you to explain that the regime in Iran and Hamas are closely tied and are of a common ideology and of a common brutality. So I just wanted to open up with that. I'll just say one other quick thing, and then I want to turn it over to Carrie, and that is that there's a big debate in Washington. Did Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guards direct and plan the attacks on 10/7? And I think in a sense, it's an irrelevant debate. I have my own view. I mean, there were multiple meetings between Khamenei, Raisi, the Revolutionary Guards, in Tehran, in Damascus. There were meetings between Revolutionary Guard commanders, Quds Force commanders, and the heads of Hamas and Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad in Beirut over the past couple of months. I find it hard to believe that they were not discussing, even in broad terms, what we saw happen over the weekend. But the point that we need to emphasize, again, is it's an irrelevant debate whether they directed and planned this attack. They financed, they supported, they trained, and they provided weapons to Hamas to carry out this kind of massacre. And this is all part of Khamenei's long-standing plan to bring death and destruction not only to Israel, not only to the Middle East, but obviously to his own people.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for your kind words, both about Nufti and the Iranian-American community. Carrie, it's a pleasure to have you. I think for the first time at a Nufti event, we're very pleased. You were here with us as a guest last year. Let's keep with the same topic. What are you seeing in Washington in terms of the response? I'm sure you were perhaps not shocked by the attack, as Mark mentioned, but what shocked you about the reaction here in Washington? What have you been seeing? And also, if you might address the debate over what Mark just talked about, the Islamic Republic's role in this attack.
Sure, and I want to reiterate Mark's thanks both for being here and for everything that everybody's doing. I think there's a good part of the reaction and a very negative part of the reaction. The good part of the reaction is we are currently seeing a relatively united policy-making community, at least, both with respect to giving Israel everything that it needs, most especially the bandwidth and runway to do whatever it thinks it needs to do to counter the threat from Hamas once and for all, but also a united desire to hold Iran responsible. I think, as it was said in the last panel, as Mark alluded to here, the question as to whether or not Iran was involved is the wrong question. The question is to what extent and how much was this directed by Iran. That is obviously still an open question, but the desire to hold the Iranian regime accountable, I think, remains strong. The fear, though, of course, those of you who have worked on Israel issues before know this very well. Right now, Israel's response in Gaza is what I would describe as relatively restrained. That's because Hamas has a number of hostages that are both Israeli as well as from, I think, close to a dozen other countries, including the United States. That's not going to last forever. And as Israel responds with appropriate force, you will start seeing the tide change a little bit, and you'll start hearing this narrative about its disproportionate, its collective punishment, and so on. So it's incumbent on all of us to make sure that the focus remains on the Iranian regime, the terrorist nature of its proxies, including Hamas, and on the victims in Israel. Another negative here is we didn't just see the deaths of 1,300 Israelis. We are starting to see a continuation of the death of the concept of truth in general. One of the things that was so important following the Holocaust was the idea of getting the message out there. People need to see what's happened, because if they see it with their own eyes, they'll believe it. Right now, they're seeing it with their own eyes, and they're not believing it. And this is something that the Iranians have been through, as many of you know, people seeing it with their own eyes and not believing it. So we need to be united as a community to ensure that we're not even just fighting disinformation and misinformation now. We're actually fighting the concept that people are exposed to the truth and they reject it, either because of their hatred for any of our populations, whether it's Iranian or Jewish, or because they don't have the capacity to understand what they're seeing. So it's very important that we all work on promoting the idea of truth and the idea of morality, because this waffling that I'm seeing in Washington, D.C., and primarily seeing, by the way, in universities, is one of the more disgusting things that I've frankly ever seen.
You talk about truth, Carrie, and the fact that I would applaud if I can, but I have a microphone in my hand. So, a truth, and you mentioned Iranians' particular familiarity with truth and with their truth being denied. For 4 decades, obviously, in Iran, from its very first day, the hostage crisis that was discussed in the previous panel, taking American diplomats hostage, the execution of Iranian military officers who had done nothing but protect their country and serve their country, the execution of Iranian Jews, of Iranian Baha'is, of Iranian women. That's continued for 44 years, and it's as if the world oftentimes doesn't accept that as a truth, to your point, and they say that this is something natural, that's part of their culture, or whatever other farcical arguments they have. And I want to ask both of you, but starting with you, Mark, do you think that's played in, or what role do you think that's played in the response that we've seen from Iranians, be they Iranian Americans like folks in this room, or Iranians inside the country, from the now famous stadium video from a few days ago to the terrorist attack in Israel? And what has been the reaction of folks in the Jewish community, or Israelis, or policymakers here in Washington? Are they surprised by the way Iranians are reacting to this and standing in solidarity? And I know you followed this, of course. We saw the Israeli government official accounts, thanking Iranians for the now viral hashtag Iranians Stand With Israel. What's been your reaction or analysis of that reaction from Iranians and how it's playing out in Israel and here in Washington?
So certainly, the response from Iranians doesn't surprise those of us who are Iran watchers, right? We know how much the majority of Iranians despise Hamas and Hezbollah and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. We know that. How do we know that? Because we heard their cries during the demonstrations, right? We didn't just hear death to Khamenei and death to the regime. We also heard stop sending our money and our support to Hamas and Hezbollah and these terrorist organizations. So those of us who watch Iran are not surprised. Unfortunately, many people don't watch what's happened or deny, as Carrie said, what is happening. They deny their own, what they see with their own eyes. So I don't think it's a surprise for us. Unfortunately, it's a surprise for many in Washington. And it's not a surprise for Israelis. I just spent 14 months in Israel. I just got back a few weeks ago. And we had a big Nowruz celebration last Nowruz in Israel. And we invited members of the Iranian-Israeli community, including Iranian-Israeli singers, and people were there, and diplomats, and we had this incredible Nowruz dinner, which got a lot of attention in Israel. And then there were visits, as you know, Cameron, by Reza Pahlavi, We saw the outpouring of emotion from Israelis. It was unbelievable, because Israelis know that their best friends in the Middle East are the Iranian people. And I hope Iranians know, and I think are starting to realize, that their best friends in the Middle East are Israelis.
Yeah, I would just agree with Mark. I don't think there was surprise so much as gratitude. I mean, there are so few points of light in all of this darkness, and seeing things like that was deeply, deeply meaningful. And I think it's not just to Israelis, but to the sort of entire Jewish population. So we're very, very grateful for that. When people are fighting their own challenges and have their own suffering, for them to be able to be aware of the suffering of others and fight on behalf of the suffering of others is really the most remarkable thing that there is, and that's what we saw with the Iranians. I would just say that what it points out is, you know, in a sense, going back to the nature of the panel, that there are two sides to what's happening in the world today. There's the side of good and there's the side of evil, and that's just the most blunt and accurate way to put it. The Iranian people, the Israelis, the United States are on the side of good. The Chinese government, the Russian government, the Iranian government are on the side of evil. You cannot divorce one from the other. All of these are mutually reinforcing in terms of our adversaries, and so we need to be mutually reinforcing in terms of our allies, and that's exactly what we saw the Iranians do in support of the Israelis.
Keeping with that theme, Carrie, in terms of what many have come to term an axis of resistance within the Middle East, but also connecting the Islamic Republic to the Chinese Communist Party, to Putin's regime in Russia, there hasn't been much said about the role, not really the role, but China's reaction or Russia's reaction to what's happened in the past several days. Starting there, but taking a step back to what you're referring to about how these dictators coordinate with one another, how they watch one another and learn from one another. We've talked about this before, and you've written and spoken about it extensively. Why do you think it is that still some folks in Washington are seemingly missing the existence of that connection, that relationship between the bad guys, if you will? And what can be done to better educate about that, to explain that to policymakers? Does it simply take a different administration? I mean, why is what's so obvious for you, and I think for many, that these bad guys are all on the same team, and that the good guys need to be on the same team? Why is that missing, and what can be done?
So I would say there's sort of like the generous interpretation of why it's being missed, and then there's the maybe more realistic interpretation. We'll see. I think, listen, there are certain people who they just are not, they're concerned about other things. So when we talk about the sort of what we see as like the rise of isolationism, which is often the group of people that are saying, you know, we shouldn't be focused on Russia because that will deter us from being focused on China. We shouldn't focus on. It's not really that many of those folks are actually ideologically opposed to American leadership. They just no longer believe that we're able to do it. It's a question of confidence, not of ideology, right? And so you can forgive them for believing that, watching the U.S. surrender basically to the Taliban, and the image that gave us, you know, the fall of Saigon, essentially, you know, empowering all of our adversaries, and that's also the message that Americans get. So there's a lot of Americans who just don't think that we have the ability to focus on all of these other threats, and when you don't think we have the ability, it's much easier to carve out specific spaces and say, I want to focus on China, I want to focus on, you know, whatever the issue may be, or I just want to focus on our own borders. I think that's an understandable impulse. Unfortunately, it's not a reflection of the reality, right? When I was in the Trump administration, the one thing that we always said to our team was, you know, we have to respond to the reality we live in, not the reality that we want. And the reality that we live in, it is incredibly clear, and I'm sure we'll talk about all of the relationships, both military, economic, and diplomatic, between China and the Iranian regime, between Russia and the Iranian regime. And all of these things are collectively not only hindering the ability of the Iranian people to have a government that represents them, to have human rights, same for those in China, same for those in Russia, but it's also undermining American interests in the region directly. It's undermining security, it's undermining human rights, it's undermining freedoms. And so I think it is important that groups like mine and Mark's try to educate people to understand precisely what these connections are and precisely how it's hindering directly American national security and, of course, global national security.
For the average observer, let's say for the person who doesn't frequently attend DC think tank panels, or the person who doesn't, read, I don't know, Foreign Policy magazine or something like that, how would you break it down? Why does it matter for an American? Why does it matter for, not our national interest broadly, but why does it matter for someone in their everyday lives? How does it impact them that the Islamic Republic, that the CCP, and Putin's regime and other dictators are collaborating and colluding? How does that hurt an average person? And perhaps, as a second question, how does a lack of a comprehensive strategy from the United States or lack of response to that coordinated threat hurt everyday Americans?
Well, I would put it simply. I mean, there's often this discussion, which I hate in Washington, D.C. You said for the average American. I really do view myself as I'm surrounded by people who are much smarter than me, much more educated than me on a daily basis. So I consider myself really among that category. And so I hear people use this phrase like the liberal international order, and it makes me want to shoot myself. And the reason is because...
Please don't do it on stage, save that.
But the reason is because you can't put four words that... I worked for the Trump administration. I'm a Republican. I guess I'll out myself here. But you can't put four more words together that Republicans in particular hate more than liberal, international, rules-based, and order, right? That is just not something that's compelling. However, what we're really talking about is an American-led system. And that matters because the strongest military and economy in the world is going to decide the preferences and operations of every other country. That has been the United States for all of our lifetimes here in this room. If that's no longer true, it's not just that we're not, in other parts of the world and we're safe here at home. It's that we won't be able to trade freely anymore, and that's going to significantly affect our economy. It's that we're going to be surveilled by those other countries. I mean, see how China operates, how the CCP operates within China, and ask yourself if that's the kind of governmental system you want to live under, right? It's not about if we're isolationists and we just protect ourselves in our own border, then we're going to get to have the same lifestyle that we've had for the last few generations. We won't. It's about choosing, do we want to decide our own national fate, or do we want China, Iran, and Russia to decide it for us? And for me, there's a very easy answer to that, and I don't understand people who have a different answer.
Mark?
So, I think brilliantly said. I would say a few things about that. Look, there's an axis of tyrannies, China, Islamic Republic of Iran. I prefer to call it the Islamic Republic in Iran, because I think the Islamic Republic is illegally occupying the great nation of Iran. And I think it's, when I hear Khamenei talking about Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories, I just want to ask him, how long have you been illegally occupying this great nation of Iran? So this axis of tyrannies, the Islamic Republic in Iran, China, Russia, North Korea, and their partners, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, others. So there is this axis. Now, I am old enough, believe it or not, to remember, being now 55, I can't believe I'm 55, the Cold War and Ronald Reagan. And the one thing about what Reagan understood is what Carrie understands, and what Carrie is exhorting people to understand, is that there is good and there is evil, right? We've all been raised in this postmodern American academic system where it's like, no, there's not really good and evil. I mean, it's people who are just misunderstood, all right? Right? I mean, you know that, and you hear that, and I'm sure some of you who are older have kids in universities who are being bombarded with this kind of propaganda. It's that kind of notion that there is an evil in the world, that Ronald Reagan, he understood there is evil in the world, and he called the Soviet Union the evil empire. And he made it very clear, we win, they lose. Right? That was his famous phrase. But Reagan didn't confront the Soviets directly. Both countries had nuclear weapons. The Soviets had a massive army. We believed at the time, they had a massive economy that industrialized faster than any other country in history. What Reagan understood is that he had to find free people, or people who were yearning to be free, to fight against Soviet domination. Well, we today have four people we know right now that are under extreme threat. Our friends in Israel, our friends in Ukraine, our friends in Taiwan, and our friends in Iran. Right? And the response to those in Washington who say, we can't do it all, we can't fight on every battlefield, we can't commit US troops around the world, the response to them is the brave people of Ukraine have already demonstrated their willingness to fight and die in defense of their country against the viciousness of Vladimir Putin. Right? The brave people of Israel have demonstrated since 1948 their willingness to fight and die against the viciousness of Khamenei and the Islamic Republic in Iran. Right? The Taiwanese people want to defend their island and their democracy and don't want to rule under the viciousness of Xi and the Chinese Communist Party. And how much more of a reminder do we need that the Iranian people are prepared to take to the streets and to fight and die in order to be free?
Why, Mark? Why is that so difficult for people to understand? Is it difficult for policymakers in Washington to understand on both sides of the aisle, because we're seeing some cracks perhaps in support for Ukraine? We don't see much support, unfortunately, as much as one would like, as much as those of us in this room would like. Tomorrow we'll talk about maximum support in much detail. But why don't we see in Washington, that connection between this axis of resistance, this axis of tyranny, as you call it? Why is it so hard to understand? Is the postmodern era that sunk in, that people have been brainwashed in their universities and they simply think that everything is a different shade of gray and there is no black and white? Why is it difficult for people to understand that, and why is it difficult to make policy based on that? Because it's often said in Washington that the United States is at a natural disadvantage vis-a-vis the CCP, vis-a-vis Putin, vis-a-vis the Islamic Republic, because they have 25-year, 50-year plans, because they have total control of their systems, and whereas we are a democracy and we're naturally weaker. I don't buy that, and I don't think that you do either. But why aren't we able to, here in Washington, why aren't we as a country able to plan a strategy that can address all of these threats and empower those people who you said are fighting? Because the other side, I think, often says, well, you simply want to send troops all over the place. Nobody is talking about sending troops to Iran or invading Iran. What we're talking about is empowering the Iranian people. We're not talking about sending American troops to Kiev, but empowering Ukrainians. Why don't people understand that, and why is it difficult to make a comprehensive strategy that addresses all of those problems?
I think it's simple. First of all, I mentioned Reagan, right? I mean, again, many of you aren't old enough to remember, but those of you who are, remember who preceded Ronald Reagan, right? Jimmy Carter, right? Weakest American president in history, complete lack of moral clarity, defeatist attitude when it came to the Soviet Union, right? Surrounded by people who, and by the way, we were just coming out of Vietnam. We were traumatized by the Vietnamese experience there. There was calls that the United States must retreat. It was very similar to what you're hearing today. Right? The 1970s reminds me of 2023, right? And then Reagan came in and said, no, we are the United States of America, and we are prepared to lead, and we have to defeat this axis of tyrannies. And then what Reagan understood is he didn't have to send US troops all over the world. He had to mobilize people who were yearning to be free. Now, Mufti has put out a whole series of excellent recommendations on how to support the Iranian people. Right? Some of those have been followed by the Trump administration, very few by the Biden administration. But let's hope we get a US president who's prepared to take a look at Mufti's recommendations and say, yes, 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 yes. That's what the Iranian people need in order to bring down Khamenei and the Islamic Republic in Iran, which, by the way, is the only solution to all of the problems we're talking about. Right? I mean, this whole discussion of Hamas and Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, and where the war is going, and Gaza, and invasion, and Hezbollah, and northern fronts. And, I mean, that is a tactical discussion that is dominating the airwaves. But we all know the only solution to peace in the Middle East is the end of Khamenei. Okay? So I assume you all agree with that. But what Mufti and the Vandenberg Coalition and FDD and many other organizations, what's incumbent upon us is to explain to policymakers and our well-intentioned friends in this city, and there are many, right, that we need to support people yearning to be free. We do not need to send American troops all over the world. But I would add this. We need the credibility of American military power, right? Khamenei, Xi, Putin need to understand that the United States has a potent military, and we're not just prepared to send carriers to the Eastern Med, right, or ammunition to Ukraine, or naval ships to Taipei, but under certain circumstances, we are prepared to use military force. And like Reagan, we can use it selectively, right, in order to send a message to these dictators that their regimes will be held hostage if they continue their aggressive and threatening activities against American interests around the world. So I'll end with just this. How many of you heard Biden's speech yesterday? Right? I don't know how many of you teared up, but I'll tell you, my Israeli friends told me, those who had seen the decapitated babies, those who had held in their arms women who had been burnt. The stories have been horrific. Were calling me and telling me the first time that they cried in 4 days of horrors was when they watched President Biden's speech. Okay? So kudos to President Biden. And however, we got to turn outrage and emotion into action. And how many of you were so frustrated when you heard all of people around the world expressing their support for the women of Iran and wondering, thank you for your outrage and your anger. Now, now what are you going to do about it to support the people on the street and not let them just be mowed down without support?
I want to sort of, I think that part of the problem here is this sort of like what I call like bumper sticker foreign policy or bumper sticker politics, where everything just has to be tweetable and tiny and sort of sloganeering. And there's this fallacy, this idea that if you believe in American leadership, then you're somehow a warmonger, right? And it's really frustrating because it is not historically borne out, even remotely. The Vandenberg Coalition was founded, it was named after a former chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Arthur Vandenberg. And he used to be an isolationist. And after Pearl Harbor, he had this famous sort of public conversion to internationalism, where he said, our oceans have ceased to be moats which automatically protect our ramparts. Essentially, no matter how much we just want to focus internally, we have enemies that are going to target us. And we saw this right before September 11th, 2001. Everybody talks about George W. Bush as a, quote, neocon president. George W. Bush ran on a Jacksonian platform that was focused on education and healthcare, period. He had said in his campaign that he wanted us to be focused much more on domestic issues. But then what happened? We were so focused internally that we missed the threats that were out there. It was the same thing in Pearl Harbor. We did everything we could to avoid getting involved into World War II. We weren't building up our military arsenal, not by any stretch. We were 17th in the world. We were after Romania. And then we got attacked. It is not when we're strong that we become a victim. It's when we are weak, and that is historically borne out. And the example that I use for average Americans to try to understand this is, if you want to ensure that your only option is not war, you need to respond before the point at which you have no other options. If you are defending your home and you have a gun in your home and somebody breaks into your house, your only option is to use the gun. But if you have set up a security system, if you've changed your routine so that nobody knows sort of when you come in and when you leave, if you have a dog, if you buy a house in a nice neighborhood, these are all things that you can do to reduce the chance that you have to eventually use force. It is the isolationists that are going to constrain us so that we have to use force in these situations. It is the people who are saying, let us provide military equipment to the Ukrainians because they don't want our boots on the ground, they just want to defeat the Russians, and we have an interest in that, that are the ones that are allowing us all to be safer and preventing a larger scale war from happening.
I'm so glad you both mentioned that, because it's so true. And it's, when we announced this conference, we announced, the two of you and many of our other speakers throughout the day, just like last year. I mean, whether it's from folks in the Islamic Republic or regime newspapers or those in Washington who toe the same line, this was called the Warmongers Conference, or, you're inviting all these people from the Jewish think tanks. I mean, the most disgusting and vile things. And first of all, we are so honored to have folks from Jewish think tanks, particularly this week, because we stand with them and not the terrorists who are trying to kill them. But I'm glad you say that, because there is this fallacy. There are, that former, now failed Iranian-American organization that spent 20 years in this city, raising God knows how many millions of dollars with the Chicken Little story of war is coming, and if you don't give me $10 right now to go meet with Javad Zarif and then go to the White House, then war is definitely coming. War never came. Indeed, the times that we got closest to war were exactly as you laid out, when the United States was weak, when the United States was not standing up for its principles for democracy and human rights for the Iranian people. And I think that that's something that has really frustrated Iranian Americans. I'm sure it's frustrated all of you for really 2 decades now, to have been slandered, to have been labeled as warmongers, as people who want to start conflicts, who don't care about innocent lives. Indeed, it's the opposite. I think it's the naivete of these people, exactly as you pointed out, that is causing people to unfortunately be killed. And we've seen that in Iran, we've seen that throughout the region, and I'm sure after this conference there's going to be more attacks of people calling for military action, which we all know is farcical. If there is conflict in the Middle East, if there is other unfortunate conflicts, in my view, there are 3 culprits. Number 1, Ali Khamenei. Number 2, the American presidents who are too weak to stand up to him. And number 3, the members of the Iran Experts Initiative, or that failed former Iranian-American organization who spent years lobbying for Khamenei's policies. And I think it's people like you all, at Vandenberg, at FDD, who care about innocent lives. These people don't care about innocent lives, clearly, because their policies have enabled these unfortunate conflicts. You both have very busy schedules. You have to fly off, I'm sure, to different parts of the world or America and do many different things. But 1 or 2 more questions before we try and get 1 or 2 questions from our audience. And I want to ask you, we've talked about this axis of tyranny, this axis of resistance. What is it that you think that dictators, be it Xi, be it Putin, be it Khamenei, or others, are watching from the United States? What are they learning? What is Xi learning from America's reaction to Putin? What is Putin learning from America's reaction, or lack thereof, to Khamenei? What sort of things what tells are these dictators watching for? How are they coordinating amongst each other? What strategies and tactics are they sharing amongst themselves, Mark?
Well, I mean, first of all, I don't think they're agonizing over whether they should support their allies and partners the way we agonize, right? I mean, I think clearly Khamenei does not, give Khamenei credit. He is very loyal to the terrorist proxies that he's built in Lebanon, in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, right? Very loyal. He will provide them everything they need: money, weapons, training, I would argue direction, planning. So he's very loyal. Putin is very loyal. I mean, Putin stood by Assad while he was massacring hundreds of thousands of Syrians. He stood by him, steadfast, didn't flinch, right? She's very loyal. She's going around the world and providing everything he can: money, weapons, political support to countries that are deeply repressive. She's sending a message by massacring Muslims in Xinjiang. Have you heard any cries from the Muslim world? Have you heard the Saudis or the Emiratis or the Jordanians or the Egyptians condemning Xi for massacring fellow Muslims in Xinjiang? So they are very, very loyal to their own proxies and to their own allies. So that's point number 1. I think, I think point number 2 on this is the coordination is clear. I mean, we haven't talked a lot about it in this panel, but let's just quickly tick it off. Like China, Islamic Republic, $400 billion military and economic deal, right? China is instrumentalizing the Islamic Republic to expand CCP power around the world. Khamenei providing suicide drones to Putin to kill Ukrainian men, women, and children. Russia reciprocating by providing weapon systems And I know there's negotiations right now for the Russians to send fighter jets and other deadly weapons to Khamenei. So sanctions busting, we heard about on the panel a lot of discussion about sanctions, right? China, Iran, and Russia. Actually, China and Russia in particular, learning from Khamenei about how to run massive sanctions busting schemes in order to evade sanctions pressure that the United States and Europe are putting today on Putin. And Xi is learning how to open up those kinds of channels should he invade Taiwan. So they're not only looking at how we respond, they're also supporting each other, and there are lessons learned from each of them. So the axis of tyrannies is alive and well, cooperating, partnering, learning from each other, testing American will, as Carrie suggested, and learning from every incident in which we demonstrate American weakness. Xi and Putin are looking today at what happened with Hamas and heard Biden's speech. I guarantee you they didn't tear up. What they're looking for is, can Biden actually enforce his commitment to provide unwavering support to Israel as it deals with Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Islamic Republic and Iran? And if he sees that America doesn't provide that support, then he will understand that they have carte blanche to do what they want to do.
Carrie?
Yeah, I would say there's a few different lessons that they're learning. So first and foremost, as I mentioned, the sort of the symbol of us leaving Afghanistan and the parallels that were drawn between the fall of Kabul and the fall of Saigon. The message that I have heard even American allies say is that the only image that they have had over the last few years of the American military was of that humiliating defeat. So one, they're learning that our military is insufficient to protect either ourselves or our allies. The second is they're learning that we're not willing to stand up for our allies. We saw this when we left Afghanistan and left behind not only Americans, but also critical Afghan partners, many of whom, by the way, in case anybody has lost a thread on that, are still not gaining the status in the United States. These are people who are translators. These are people who helped our special operations officers in our military. And there's about 7,000 of them that are in the United States that don't yet have status because we've been so slow in processing that. So they're learning that we won't stand up for our allies. That was the message that Putin got that I think empowered him to invade Ukraine. It's the same message that Xi will get if we fail to deter, or if we fail to respond to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and Xi will learn it and will invade Taiwan. I mean, almost certainly. Why wouldn't he at this point? So they're learning our military is weak. They're learning we won't stand up for our allies. They're learning that if they can address the American public, they can sway our opinion. This is why TikTok is one of the most dangerous apps that we have, because the Chinese government is specifically using that to try to spread narratives about American interventionism, to try to get people to fight amongst each other, to split the Democrats and Republicans so that we're not united on issues, because they know that a country internally divided cannot stand. And so not only are we ceding ground to them by allowing them to do that, but it's also just perpetuating this sense of our lack of unity. And we see this in the House of Representatives every day. I commend those of you who work regularly with them because it is, seeing 15 votes for speaker and then the speaker gets out for the first time in American history is pretty humiliating and embarrassing. And I think, what they're learning most importantly is the gaps in American leadership are opportunities for them. This is especially true for China. China had almost no relationship with Afghanistan and with the very prevalent mines that are in Afghanistan until the United States left. And in those last 2 years, they have gained control over essentially all of the major producing mines in Afghanistan. Iraq was the #1 recipient of BRI aid. Despite the fact that the Middle East was never a target for Chinese BRI investments up until our withdrawal from Afghanistan. When we leave, they fill the gap. And so this is why it's critically important that as much as we should be focusing on the threat that the CCP poses to the United States and to the sort of American-led system, we need to not lose sight of one, our allies around the world, but two, what they're doing all around the world to sow disinformation, to sow discord, to promote human rights abuses, and to attack the American-led system. And in terms of what the results of this are going to be, well, all of these relationships, as Mark mentioned, the goal is to contest U.S. global positioning. It's to promote alternatives to Western norms. It's to reduce the U.S. presence in the region and, frankly, throughout the world. It's to weaken our sanctions regimes. And fundamentally, it's to ensure the survival of dictatorships. And so the future that we can envision if the United States and its allies don't stand up to this is a very dystopian future in which the CCP, the Iranian regime, and Putin are basically running around the world, sowing whatever human rights violations they want to, waging war on sovereign nations, promoting and empowering terrorist regimes all across the world. I mean, it is not just let's sit and be happy inside our country. It's a ridiculous belief. And so I think what we're seeing with the terrorist attacks in Israel, hopefully is, as the Iranian people showed, sort of an acknowledgement and a unity that it's not just the tyrannies that are united, it needs to be also the democracies and the resistance.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I actually, I don't know if how many of you saw in social media that in Taipei, the largest tower in Taipei was lit up with the Israeli flag. In Ukraine, government buildings were lit up with the Israeli flag. Zelensky flying to Israel to express his strong support for Israel. I think, and you saw it, obviously, unfortunately, the regime is not showing the Israeli flag in Tehran, but the Iranian people are. I mean, how many of you saw that social media posting in that soccer stadium?
Are you referring to the famous Iranian poets at the soccer stadium and their chants?
Yes. That was so awesome. But that was seen, and it was seen in Israel. My Israeli friends were sending that to me, right? So this notion that Carrie is underscoring, that the need for us to unite, right? As Iranians, as Americans, as Israelis, as Ukrainians, as Taiwanese, and other people, again, yearning to be free. Like, this is Reagan's vision. This is Reagan's strategy. And we have evidence that the strategy worked, right? And I remember it was 1989, I guess. I was at McGill University in Montreal taking Soviet studies. And it was pre-internet, if you can believe, pre-cell phones. We actually had textbooks. Some of you remember what a textbook is? We had textbooks about the Soviet Union. And on that morning, my professor came into class and she said, I'd like everybody to get up, bring your textbook to the front of the room, and I'd like you to throw it into that garbage can. We didn't even have recycling bins in those days. So we all got up. I mean, we had paid like $100 for that textbook, and we all got up and we threw our textbooks into the garbage can, and we sat down and we said, what's going on, Professor? And she said, the Berlin Wall just came down. The Berlin Wall came down. And by the way, a lot of what's in your textbook was wrong, right? And who knew that it was wrong? Ronald Reagan. Because a lot of what was in that textbook were the thoughts of these great Soviet experts and criminologists who believed the Soviet Union would survive for 1,000 years, just like many thought the German Reich would survive, including, obviously, Hitler believed his Reich would survive for 1,000 years. I am 100% confident the Islamic Republic in Iran is coming down, and we need to do everything possible to bring it down.
On that excellent note, we have a very small amount of time for one or two audience questions. If my colleagues would bring around some microphones. If you have a question, just raise your hand, please. Here in the front, no, there, John. And for our questions, if you wouldn't mind, please identifying yourselves and your affiliation.
Hi, my name is Armin Bahman, and I'm actually Iranian-American activist since Mahsa Amini was killed by the terrorist government of Iran. I'm 1/4 Iranian. My late father, his father, my grandfather, was born in Shiraz, Iran. And after the turn of the century, he came to the US via Austria. So I don't speak I speak very little Farsi because my grandfather died 3 years before I was born. So I have a lot, I have many Iranian American friends in this country, and then they also have people, family over there. And it's been a horrible situation over the last 44 years. Actually, in the mid-'70s, my late parents used to go to the parties at the Iranian embassy in Washington, which is just a vacant building right now. And in 1979, when the Shah was exiled and he was in the Bahamas, my late father played tennis with Riza and with the Shah. It was
Pretty good tennis partners, I'd say.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Your questions, sir, because we're very
okay.
short
Yeah, but
on time.
I'm going to
Yes.
give the questions now. It's to either Mark or Carrie. Why don't you think there's been any? Let's say, like you've heard of Peshmerga, right? That's like the Kurdish group that basically they're like a military, paramilitary group. Why do you think they haven't gone into Iran and made little hits like at military installations? I'm wondering if there's any way the United States can empower like a proxy groups like this in order to go into Iran, even though we don't want to bring our military, to get groups like Peshmerga to go in there and hit military installations. Just real quick, and I got one more question.
Unfortunately, there probably won't be time for that. I'll amend the question slightly with your permission.
Okay.
Thank you. You can give the mic back to my colleague. Thank you, sir.
Look, real quick answer. Military support for Iranians inside Iran, obviously an issue that to be discussed, but we're not even close to providing any kind of serious non-military support for Iranians inside Iran. Serious technology support, right? Nufti came up with a great idea, which is to set up a labor strike fund so that you can provide what Iranians need when they go on strike, because they don't have unions that are going to provide them with money so they can put food on the table. Right? There's a whole list of things short of even providing weapons or sending in the Peshmerga into Iran that need to be done in order to help the Iranians, who, by the way, are on the streets every single day. I would just commend you to the FDD. We have a tracker every week, a detailed tracker of the number of protests that are taking place still today in Iran, where they're taking place, and the regime's repression. It's a story that has disappeared from the media. We are really continue to remind people the protests are not over. And we believe that there'll be a major eruption again, and the United States government should be prepared for that opportunity to support the Iranians.
Before we go to maybe one last question, there's a young lady up here that had raised her hand. But just to add on to what you said, Mark, sometimes I sense that people jump to really radical solutions without having considered or even started the most basic solutions, and that's what you alluded to. They're very basic things the U.S. government should be doing. The U.S. government should very simply say that the Iranian people have as a democratic right to determine their own future. The U.S. government doesn't even say that. So before we talk about arms or things that I think all of us are largely opposed to because it's so dangerous, can have so many negative consequences, the very basic steps have to be done. And I appreciate you mentioning maximum support. And the tracker that you all have at FDD is so fantastic because there's so many easy excuses for people to say there's no more protests, what's going on. The Iranian people are protesting and showing their resistance every single day, just as Ukrainians are, as folks in Israel now are, as the Taiwanese are. So your tracker is a great tool. So I think the very last question, brief, please identify yourself and your affiliation. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm an Iranian American activist. And while we were in this panel, there was a tweet by the Spectator Index that says, breaking CBS News reports the U.S. has reached a quiet understanding with Qatar not to release any of the $6 billion in Iranian funds that were set to be transferred. I was wondering if you guys have any opinions on that.
I have opinions.
Please.
This is the kind of thing that'll get me in trouble in a future administration or confirmation hearing, probably.
This is a safe space, don't worry.
Well, yeah, but I see the recordings going on. But in any case, yeah, I have strong opinions. One, I hope it's not true. I wouldn't be surprised if it is true. That $6 billion, as was mentioned in the last panel, Gabe Naranjo mentioned very clearly that it is able to be refrozen and redirected, I think either to Israel or to the victims of state sponsors of terrorism fund is the right thing to do. The Iranian regime specifically mentioned that the money that would be spent, that the $6 billion would be used on, would be to backfill money that they had already spent, right? So that means that money is actually, even if it hasn't been spent yet, going to go to refill the coffers of the terrorists who committed these acts and of the Iranian regime that supported it. Frankly, I think not only should we not be having that discussion with Qatar, we need to be reconsidering our major non-NATO ally status with Qatar. I see no reason for us to continue that. They have been nothing but an antagonist, frankly, especially as it relates to the support of the Iranian regime and its antagonism towards Israel.
And their strong support for Hamas.
And their strong support for Hamas. And I just think this is a perfect example of the United States is, I'll say unintentionally, but who knows, is emboldening our adversaries directly. That's my money. I'm an American taxpayer. That's my money that has gone to slaughter my own people in Israel. Sorry.
So I don't know if I heard it correctly that you said that they're not going to release those funds, or they are going to release those funds. They will not release the funds to the regime in Iran.
Oh.
Yeah. Yes.
Then I take back everything that I said.
No. Carrie doesn't need to take it back.
Oh, okay.
Carrie articulated exactly the reason why they must not release the money to the regime in Iran. And Carrie's views, by the way, have been supported by bipartisan members of Congress who've come out recently and have made it very clear that they must not release that money. The administration, if that's true, the administration is finally listening to Americans who understand that the $6 billion, and by the way, not just the $6 billion in Qatar, but the $10 billion in Oman that came from Iraq, right, must not be released to this criminal regime in Iran. And what we do with the money, whether it's money for U.S. victims of terrorism, whether it's money to be held for the Iranian people, whether it's money to be provided to Israelis who've been massacred, that's a policy discussion that we can have at a later stage. But if the administration, if it's true, it's a good sign that maybe finally the administration is waking up to the reality that the more billions of dollars you give this criminal regime in Iran, the more it'll slaughter its own people and slaughter other people.
And I would just add, if it's true, one of the things that I was very moved also by the president's remarks, but one thing that I think we all probably noticed was that there was not a single mention of Iran in his remarks. And so there has been this fear, obviously evidenced by my immediate misunderstanding of what the administration did, that we would not understand and appreciate the significant role that Iran plays in this. And so this could be a profound moment, if true, where we can actually acknowledge the Iranian role, stop getting too focused on the specifics of what it was, and just acknowledge that these are all interconnected regimes.
I hope that the Biden administration listens to what Mark said, listens to what Dr. Ganji said at the beginning, that these are all great steps. If that's true, it's a great step. This will all continue as long as the Islamic Republic is in power. And if you really want to end this, if you really want to end support of Hamas, PIJ, etc., fixing the Qatar relationship is great, but Islamic Republic is where it is. Thank you very much, Mark Dubowitz and Carrie Filipetti, for being with us today.
Thank you all for this excellent panel. We now invite you to join us for lunch.
Music?